This is Cents Per Mile, featuring Charles Gracie, Paul Gibson, and Josh Haynes. Everyone knows the trucking industry has issues, but most people are afraid to talk about it.
Someone's got to do it.
With loads of recruiting and marketing experience and backed by the largest driver audience in the world, we deliver carriers the driver perspective, find solutions, and help make sense make sense.
Welcome to Cents Per Mile. I'm your host, Charles Gracie.
And I'm your co-host, Paul Gibson.
Hey, I'm Josh Haynes, and you listening to me for these 5 seconds is more than most carriers listen to drivers. Charles, what are we talking about today?
We are bringing in the industry's best, brightest experts to talk about all things trucking.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about all things trucking. We're also probably going to ask them about some of the hot takes we've made earlier in the year. But with that, it is time to say the things we always say. So you can find us on Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music, etc., YouTube, anywhere that you like essentially take in content. So if you could like, subscribe, or rate, depending on the platform, because that helps push us out a little bit further. More people see it, and we get to do cooler stuff.
You can also go to centspermilepodcast.com where you can suggest a topic to be a guest or even to become a sponsor.
Sponsor? Speaking of sponsors, who's our sponsor today, Charles?
We got Drivers Legal Plan. They are an actual law firm dedicated to protecting the rights of truck drivers, therefore the interest of the trucking companies. Go to visit them at driverslegalplan.com.
All right, well, I guess it's time for the news. All right, so it's time for 10-2 News, where typically we look at CDLLife in the past few weeks and find the coolest, craziest, and most interesting articles we can, and then we talk about it. And today we're kind of going to do that. So I don't normally get pretty personal on the podcast relatively. But since we talked about my dating life on the last episode that wasn't F3 coverage, have I got a story for you. All right. So if you recall earlier this year, we covered a story about a truck driver who stopped off at a Buc-ee's and he was bobtailed, just pulled into the parking lot. Everything was fine, went in the store. And they were like, oh, we're going to refuse service to you because you parked a truck in our lot and you can't do that. So that driver reasonably took his truck and went and parked it in a public space that was not on their lot, walked back to the Buc-ee's, and they still told him that they couldn't help him. All right. So this comes into play. It's very important for the story. Dating apps are a thing. I haven't been single that long after a long time of not doing that. So been checking them out. And I got on a date with this lady, right? And so we go out to dinner. And we start, making small talk about what we do for work. And so it turns out that she is an urban planner for a county over on the Kansas side. I live on the Missouri side. She's on the Kansas side. The one she works in, the only thing that people seem to be interested in is the fact that they got a new Buc-ee's. And I was like, oh, Buc-ee's? Yeah. She's like, what's wrong with Buc-ee's? And so I go on to explain that story about the driver. And she says, well, that happened because they have to go through a lot of processes with codes and stuff like that. And that's in the fight to get the permission to build it. That's easier to not deal with than it is to deal with. And I was like, well, but here's my question. If they would have let that driver into the Buc-ee's, everything that they bought, how did it get there? And she was like, well, it came on a truck, obviously, but that's not part of the parking code. So that's part of the business that's allowed. And she went on to talk about how I-70 had closed in a certain area where they couldn't get to the rest stop. So on her street, I guess a lot of drivers were pulling off and parking. And she was like, it was so inconvenient. Some people couldn't even get out of their driveways. There were trucks everywhere and they were running and it was loud. And I was like, your frustration is misguided. It should not be at the drivers. And then I started to not voluntarily raise my voice a little bit and went on a big rant about hours of service. Drivers are the most exploited workforce in America. We don't do anything to help. There's 11 trucks for every spot. They can't help it. And as an urban planner, she is doing nothing to solve the problem.
Paul, did you tank your date over driver rights and work talk?
She tanked the date.
I mean, I feel like the rant part, the description might be spot on here. And I've talked to you enough to know you can't do that.
I can't. I couldn't not. I mean, if you're going to sit there and like tell me that drivers being forced to park in a place that you don't want them to park is an inconvenience and defending somebody for not servicing a truck driver, I can't. It just flipped a switch. But she did text me. She said, home. And I said, I'm glad you made it safe. She said, thank you for the evening. Do you want to see me again?
So is this a to be continued story?
No, because I then said, you seem great, but I'm going to be honest, as obscure and weird as it might sound, the misplaced frustration with drivers and truck parking kind of killed it for me, and that is literally my biggest passion. And she responded with, that's too bad. I suppose I'm relaying the complaints I get 2 to 3 times a week about them, which is also frustrating. It's too bad you aren't utilizing your platform to lobby for changes in local ordinance to alleviate both our issues. But I understand. I wish you the best. I do not leverage this platform to make noise about changes that we need in the infrastructure for right. Anyway,
I mean, maybe part of your dating profile is a link to the show. Context might help.
Or that documentary where I shut myself in the closet to protest all of this, or a hot truck, or, you know, the work we do with OIDA and all kinds of stuff. But it is what it is.
Yeah, I don't know, man. I think at least on the first date, there should be a zero work talk based on current events and success ratios that we're seeing.
I just asked what she did, and it turned into that.
Maybe you should just be like, are you a truck driver? You want to go on a date?
Listen. My recommendation is wear the banana suit on the next first date, because I feel like that's a crowd pleaser, you know.
I don't know about that. But what I will say is what's crazy to me is those people exist.
Well, of course they exist. That's where the complaints come from. And I see it from both sides, because if I bought a house in a residential area, I'm a former driver, but I'm saying if I bought a house in a residential area,
is your house not in a residential area?
I'm specifying, because if you go to Elwood, Illinois, they're right next to the industrial area. But if I bought a nice house in an area, I probably don't want to see an armada of reefers outside my front door, but I'd probably be a little bit more understanding because I came from the industry. And I realized that sometimes, hey, your clock's running out. You don't have any other option. You got to deliver somewhere that might have a street closed. I think it comes down to an education piece, which is where we have these conversations and why we have them on the show. But I also think people nowadays are set in what they want. It's all about me, what I want, my inconveniences, and the empathy goes a long way. And you don't see as much of it, especially towards today's drivers. During COVID, you saw a whole bunch of it. After COVID, it kind of died off. You have a lot of people back to saying it and not practicing it. And this is where that education and that empathy should come into play.
So, all right. So I am talking to somebody. She doesn't listen to the podcast. She's pretty great. But she also doesn't hate drivers. So anyway, enough about me. It's time to go to an ad break, and then it's time to make sense.
Attention truckers, it only takes one ticket to lose your job because of unnecessary traffic convictions. But you can protect your career with Driver's Legal Plan, an actual national law firm dedicated to protecting the rights of truck drivers. We make the highest quality legal representation available to truck drivers, and we make it affordable. You can rest easy knowing you have a trucker's attorney always on your side. Call Driver's Legal Plan today to start protecting your driving record and your career.
So now it's time to make sense. And we brought the best, the brightest industry experts to you to help do that, because there's a lot more qualified people than Paul and myself. But I want to give a shout out, because one person, it's their first, well, there's actually two people here that it's their first time on the show. George, we had you on our match show. That was pretty exciting.
Yeah.
Welcome back. I have a coworker who has never been on the show. That is a epic failure on my part, but she's one of my favorite coworkers. We got Leah Shaver here.
Hey, everybody. Thank you. Thanks for having me. Thanks for the invite.
I got to be better.
We can only go up from here, right?
Right?
That's what I say that every time. It's not the case.
Paul, there was more meaning there for you, maybe than for the rest of us.
We'll do a poll on everyone if they think Paul's methods for dating are appropriate or not. We'll do that in the comments. But yeah, we're bringing to the forefront a lot of the issues that have been plaguing the industry in 2024, looking for solutions that might be on the forefront going into 2025. And we thought, who better than everyone here? So I'm going to go around with some questions that have come in from our listeners. Paul's got a couple as well, but let's get to it. One of the most common questions that we've been plagued with is driver's pay. And it kind of stems into a couple other areas. Do we see this come into a resolution? It's always a conversation. It's been a conversation for a long time, but yet we're still talking cents per mile.
On cents per mile.
No pun intended.
Yes, it was.
Leah, what's your take on this? I mean, do you see changes happening, meaningful changes that are going to result in not only retaining today's drivers, but also attracting new ones? I mean, I know you guys do a lot of data and analytics over there as far as what's coming down the pipeline. What do you see?
Yeah, I definitely think that meaningful change with driver pay has arrived and will continue to come. It happens in different ways at different types of companies, but to get more geeky on that item, I think it's important that we talk about what really influences driver pay. And that would be capacity and demand for capacity. It would be freight rates. It would be driver turnover and driver supply. All of those elements, if you take them into account, you know that we have excess capacity in the market, though it is coming down, that freight rates are relatively at a standstill, that driver turnover remains a problem, and that driver supply, we've got excess in terms of driver supply. So as long as we have excess capacity and we have lower demand for that capacity, you're going to continue to see total deadlock in freight rates. And as long as freight rates are not accelerating, you will not see pay at for-hire fleets accelerate. That doesn't take into account, though, the narrowest part of the lead funnel, are highly skilled drivers, the more nuanced fleets, and also private fleets. Those folks are all making intentional moves with their pay. They're making meaningful changes with their pay structure, with how they pay, with what they pay, and with what they're doing with pay in the future. And they also, in terms of the future, they're looking at planning, they're looking at growth, and compensation is at the core of all of that for their moves today and tomorrow.
So one of the interesting things I find on this is working on the side of things in recruiting and consulting. One of the most common questions I've gotten recently is, has driver pay gone down? Should I lower my driver pay? And it's kind of one of those things where I scratch my head. I'm like, you got drivers coming in. You have a pipeline formed. Why visit this? Why consider lowering the pay if it's working? And they're like, well, what's my competitors doing? And there's a lot of resources that provide that data. Are you seeing driver pay get turned down and go backwards right now?
No. It is going down in terms of their gross income if productivity is lower. But in terms of the base rates of pay, we're not seeing meaningful reductions. It is less expensive to take on a new driver today. So carriers are not putting as much in the front side of attracting a driver and producing churn. There's not enough opportunities. There's interest in the market for drivers looking at other jobs, but there's not enough carriers making big moves and trying to attract folks to come in and start day one. So it's less expensive today to hire a driver, whether they're newly tenured or new in the industry. There's less of that, of the latter. But the bottom line is it's less expensive today to start a new driver, and it doesn't take as much as it was before to keep drivers.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Now, Tim, that leads me into my next question, which is, how can companies better retain experienced drivers in a competitive market while attracting new drivers? And do you see the market we're in right now impacting this effort?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, on the last part first, the what we've seen from a driver retention, or how often and how drivers would think about the market. Um, Drivers are staying longer with their current carrier than we've seen in a long time, which is really counterintuitive. Normally, in a weak economy, drivers are quicker to kind of see if the grass is greener on the other side of the fence. And over the past year, that behavior has significantly changed. And I think the interesting thing from our perspective is, if the freight market continues to get better, if Craig Fuller's right and the freight recession is over,
I think he said it was dead. Like there was a tombstone. That was pretty definitive.
fantastic. I hope he's right. Uh, that'd be great news. Normally, when the market gets better, drivers stay longer. I don't think that's going to happen this time around. I think there's a lot of people sort of pent up, and I think driver retention is going to get harder as the market gets better, which is going to be really. We haven't seen that in a long time, if ever, that dynamic. We've never seen it in the data, and so what we see fleets doing that are having the best success on retention. Is simply they walk the talk, right? I mean, they're consistent in how they interact with drivers, with the promises they make in recruiting come through in operations. Hey, they're consistent in terms of their interactions between safety and operations and maintenance, and that's way easier said than done. But the people who do that and have the most consistent touch points, they have the best driver retention. And interestingly, they also have the best safety outcomes as well.
I mean, relationships go a long way. And if you form those relationships, people are buying into not only the pay, but the job as a whole, the culture. But you have to put that work on the forefront. And one of the things that I always kind of chuckle at is it's such an easy solution to find. It just takes time.
Oh, yeah.
You see people all the time throwing money at stuff, but they don't want to take the time. They just want to throw money and fix it. You don't get that instant gratification without rolling up your sleeves.
No, I think that's exactly right. It's way easier said than done, and I think it takes attention and intention, right? It doesn't happen by accident. That's for sure.
No, thank you. So the next one, and I'm going to give this to you, Marilyn, is what impact does the requirements of the CDL licenses have on addressing the driver shortage, and is age the only solution?
I personally don't believe that age is the only answer. I believe that age is one of the answers. I think that the pilot program, although we haven't seen a lot of participation, I think that there is still there's a strong pathway for those 18 to 20-year-old drivers and getting them into the market. And I think that I think there is. I think there is. I mean, I think we're going to go into recruiting crisis 2025 like we haven't had a recruiting crisis in a long time. And I think that really, but since we've had this discussion on the table, if you take kind of the crisis that was COVID out of it, we haven't had a strong driver market.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I don't hear, at least in the market publicly, people saying we're never going to hire 18 to 20-year-old drivers. I mean, at the biggest fleets, at the smallest fleets.
Well, insurance, it's not that they don't want to. Insurance becomes the biggest obstacle. I mean, we talk about it a lot here.
Biggest obstacle for absolutely everything.
Insurance, like from what I see, my perspective on this is we have the platform and the infrastructure to attract these younger drivers. But when it actually gets to putting the next foot forward, there's no one that can hire them because they can't insure them. And then when you compound that with the market that we're currently in, where people are near capacity, if they're doing anything remotely right, they're near capacity. Why would I take that added risk or that added cost? So these people are just sitting there finding other industries to go in because no one can hire them. And that seems like a problem.
You worked at a trucking company, Charles, and you know recruiting crises inside of trucking companies propel a lot of things to happen that would not happen, outside of that crisis. And so when we're talking about the age, well, really any of the regulatory requirements, I think that the need and the big carriers and the folks who can get involved when they feel the pain enough to make the waves, that's when those changes will happen. I believe age, I believe the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse and what we do with the reclassification of marijuana and how we measure impairment and how we're able to eventually at some point, I think we have to figure out a way to hire those drivers. I think that change, that opens up a population of drivers that right now have been eliminated with really no plan to re-enter the market. And so I think that is something, that technology also exists and will only get better over the next, 5 years as we look at, how do we leverage the technology that we have, to solve some of these problems to open up our driver pool a little bit more.
Thank you for that. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and look at this from the carrier's perspective. So we got Brian. Brian, you're over there with Decker Truck Line. I mean, you guys are hiring drivers. You have a need. You're dealing with the pain of the market. What do you see coming down in 2025? Is it going to be a heavy need for drivers right off the bat? Like people are hoping like everything's been solved. We're in a new year, got a new election decided. Is everything looking bright and sunny over there, or are you guys expecting to feel some pain because things take time?
Well, things take time, and and especially in our industry and all these economies, everyone forgets really quick. We're still, I think, evaluating as an industry the impact of this owner-operator gluttony that we had, and on used equipment and trucks and spot rates and everything like that. So I think every trucking company is going to really look at their numbers here at the end of fourth quarter, first part of first quarter, come up with a little bit stronger plan. I don't like to watch the news. I like to drive by a flatbed company and see if there's a bunch of flatbeds sitting there, the economy's bad. If all the flatbed trailers are on the road, the economy's good. That's the best indicator. So we're seeing it pick up. It's going to be slow. You're still having capacity issues, just the staffing at the shippers and the receivers. So once that can stabilize a little bit better, I think it's going to gradually increase, but it's not going to be first quarter. January 1st, the whole world's better.
What?
I know. I'm sorry, but I think everyone has learned their lessons from COVID. They've learned their lessons again this year.
Some are still learning them. Some of these people are still stuck with those enormous truck payments that they thought were a great idea before COVID, and they're trying to make ends meet. I mean, we haven't seen a thinning of the herd that everyone thought we were going to see during this. And I think that's part of the pain point of why it was so prolonged.
It's I think they always say bad revenue will spotlight your bad decisions. Good revenue masks them or, hides them. So I think we've had a good year and a half run of the right kind of lighting to see what we need to do to get ourselves back into shape. And I think a lot of companies are doing a lot of good things, like you guys were mentioning earlier with the retention, taking care of the drivers. Obviously everyone's going to be looking at driver pay. So I think we're in a good place as far as our company goes. Moving forward, we're expecting growth, and we're going to continue to grow. So this is a good opportunity for the companies that weathered the storm and are stepping off on the right foot.
I imagine being a carrier too. I mean, this is fourth quarter. There's a lot of things that are happening, not to mention peak/not peak, depending on who you are and what niche you're in. You got plate and insurance renewals. You have all of these different things that are cumulatively happening behind the scenes in Q4. That's a stressor on a carrier side. That's a huge, straw that breaks the camel's back. Do you think that we might have a couple other carrier fatalities before we enter in the first quarter?
I think you will. Unfortunately, I think you're going to see a little bit more of acquisitions starting off. Because if you're going to grow, I mean, it was, I think, Heartland 20 years ago that said, whoever has the most drivers wins. And that stands true today. So if you can't find them in the market,
or has the biggest marketing bill,
yeah, if you can't find them in this market, you got to go grab them somewhere. So I think you are going to see a little bit more shifting around Q1, Q2, but nothing too egregious.
So you guys are pretty optimistic going into next year. Like, you're not expecting like this big bang of solutions there January 1st. You're pretty much fallen in suit with everyone else. It's going to be gradual. That's good. From a carrier's perspective, that's what we want to hear. All right, next question. One of the biggest topics that really has plagued fourth quarter is fraud prevention. I mean, one of the things that has become the elephant in the room is while everyone was locked down due to COVID, people found creative ways to scam people.
And so much seafood missing in the Northeast.
So Danielle, what's happening on that front? I mean, is this going to continue to be this thing that's just going to keep growing bigger and bigger, and we need a bill to go before Congress and divine intervention to fix this, or are there things being put in place to help address this? And how big of a problem is it?
Well, it's definitely a big problem. I do think it came a long ways. I think the FMCSA is really aware of the issue, and they're doing a good job at coming up with a new plan. They were actually at the Broker Carrier Summit this year. Ken Riddle was the director. Yeah, and he came on stage, like displayed kind of their whole layout of what's coming. And a lot of security measures are going into place, because before, that people could fax in a change, and that's how people were hacking into people's FMCSA data and pretty much hijack their whole carrier profile. So FMCSA is very aware of that. They know that. They also cannot make it where, like, whenever they implemented that the license needed to be sent in, well, you basically gave the scamsters a new way of overcoming it. Like, hey, I need a picture of your driver's license, as they were scamming people, and then they would send that into FMCSA. So they're aware that the step that they need to take has to be a lot more than just giving the scamsters a tool to do more bad. So they're coming up with like facial recognition, which will be going into place just like you do like at the airport, going into like Clear, for instance. So facial recognition into going into your FMCSA account, setting up a new broker, carrier authority. So they really are making a bunch of steps. So I think fraud wise, as far as like being so scared of using a brand new carrier, I think that part of it would be eliminated, because really, honestly, a brand new carrier may even be more secure than somebody who's been out there for a while, because they're underneath the new FMCSA guidelines. So on that front, I think it's coming a long ways. Do I think fraud's going to go away? No, it's going to be a big issue. They're going to come up with something else. They always do. But there's hope.
The extended car warranty stuff. I mean, I kind of welcome any change on this front.
Yeah. So it'll be interesting what's coming, but I don't think it's going to go away. That's for sure.
So you think it's just going to be constant innovation to keep battling the innovative new ways people are finding to scam people?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, that's what we're having to do at my company, is just constantly listen to the front lines. Hey, what's happening? What are you guys hearing? And then how do we develop something to combat that? I mean, innovation on the tech world, you got to have something, I feel like, nowadays to protect yourself. And then even as on a carrier level, hey, if you're hearing somebody ask you these type of, vetting questions, take that as hey, they're more of a legitimate broker or shipper than somebody who's just like, hey, yeah, I'm sending you on the load, sending right to you right now, and you never, you're not having to prove anything. To me, it's less of a red flag whenever someone's asking those right questions.
Well, and these things can make or break a business. When you're big, they compile and they add up to a sizable dollar amount. But when you're a small carrier or small brokerage, these things can hurt. George, when we're talking about things that you see as pain points for owner operators or small fleet owners, is fraud one of the things that is directly impacting? Is it payment delays? Is it, just the cost of daily running rates? Like, what do you see as the biggest obstacle for owner operators?
Yeah, anytime that you're dealing with a fraud situation or scenario and we're questioning a load, it could be a legit load that someone is confused about, whether it be a broker or whatnot. Fraud is so prevalent that everything is on high alert. So if you're putting a customer that may be even a valid customer, maybe a valid load, you're putting them on a hold so that you can make sure I'll do all the due diligence in the background. You could be in a position where you're making that driver wait, or you're making that company owner wait. Because a lot of these companies are 1 to 2 truck companies. $1,000 or $2,000 could be the meaning of, I signed up with this broker. I know whenever I haul X load and I deliver, I know I've got money right away, so I'm going to be able to make my next delivery. Or am I sitting for 2 days waiting for a particular load to be verified? So that's really the biggest thing with our current clientele, is just making sure that we have positions in place that we can try to avoid delayed funding. but then also on client setup, making sure that we're doing everything we can to make sure we've got the right people that are actually setting these companies up, and they're not somebody that's frauded the FMCSA and getting them set up. That's really means we're not going to get away from fraud, but we're going to do everything we can. And down the middle made a great point about carriers also need to understand that there's going to be factoring companies, there's going to be compliance companies, there's going to be brokers, shippers. They want more information about who is hauling this load, and as opposed to it being a deterrent, they need to understand the reason and the background why. Because we still hear it now because we have ID liveness, so we check, IDs versus facial recognition on your phone. And we'll hear folks like, well, this is too much to get set up with you guys. I'm going to set up with someone else. And then you have to have the conversation. Look, this is for your benefit. This is for us to know that who you are so that nobody else can come in and try to defraud your company. So but it's going to be an ever growing thing. But our biggest side is how can we reduce it so that we're not delaying payment.
That's interesting. So, I mean, cumulatively, all these questions that we've had, they've all come back to just continued education, awareness. These issues are going to keep evolving. And as soon as we solve one, they're going to progress in this phase 2 of solving it completely. There's no Band-Aid fix for this stuff to go away, whether we're talking about driver pay, attracting new drivers into the market, regardless of what we're talking about. It's going to be ongoing and nothing's going to end starting January 1st.
Speaking of awareness and putting yourself out there, it's time for our last ad break. We're excited to announce CDL Connect Sessions, powered by CDLLife. 8 engaging webinars filled with insights and fresh strategies to transform how you connect with drivers. Join us Thursday, December 19th for our 8th session. Optimizing recruiting for executives, from KPIs to cost-effective hiring models, with Kevin Hall, Chief Executive Officer at CDLLife. Learn some of the latest advances in recruiting, along with proven processes that can turn recruiting into a competitive advantage. You'll gain actionable KPIs and insights to empower your recruiting team to reach their full potential. Click the link in the description to register. Well, that was a lot of information. That was a lot, and a lot of good opinions, and some definitely things that I hadn't thought of previously. But yeah, so it is definitely time, because that was a lot.
Yeah, I appreciate everyone tuning in. I appreciate everyone that shared those perspectives. But thanks for tuning in to Cents Per Mile. I'm your host, Charles Gracie.
And I'm your co-host, Paul Gibson. See you next time.